Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Appreciate it. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Rich, for the introduction. If any of you are founders in here, highly, highly recommend applying for the King's Capitalize. It was the most fun grant award to win. The whole conference circumstance. I was a cool mom. I have a 6 and 8-year-old. I got to have my kids out on court with me, so it was lovely. Are you connected to me?
Yeah.
Okay,
You had me up there in the first place.
We did.
That's not coming back up.
Cool. Well, while you figure that out, I can go ahead and jump in. So obviously, Rich gave you guys an introduction. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and kind of how I found myself here. So quick background, I started my journey in corporate finance. I was doing that for 7 years. I'm not a coder by trade or design. I then very quickly realized that was sucking the soul out of me. And so I started getting into the world of nonprofit, discovered I really had a passion for education, ended up moving abroad to India, did a nonprofit there for 5 years that was working with kids in slum communities to support them in their educational journey. From there, I ended up staying in India, and I moved to India, and I started my first SaaS company there that was working with nonprofits with a focus on education on recruitment and sharing of best practices. Did that for another 5 years. I do things in 5-year chunks is what I realized. Finally met my now husband, got married, got pregnant with my first daughter, came back to America, and started working at a school. The dream was to start my own school, so I thought I should work at one first, and I very quickly realized I'm not a morning person, so I probably won't do that. But it taught me a lot about being in the world of education and how schools operate, and I very quickly found myself doing an entrepreneurial venture while I was at the school based out of San Jose, built a platform for them that was looking at ed tech data, and then during COVID, we started sharing that. So we grew to about 100 schools in about 6 months. We were working to spin our startup off, and the board decided they were a no-go. So I left after that.
Which camera one?
I can unplug and plug. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, let's find out. Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
There you go.
We're good. Sometimes that unplugged plug works.
You can knock everything from the background.
Anyhow, when I was working at, I was running my former startup, I really started diving deep into the world of data and education. And what it really meant for teachers, particularly to look at this very, very concrete granular level data and how they apply that then to what's happening in the classroom. And surprisingly, that rarely happens. Most schools, most districts are looking at doing a deep dive of data, if at all, about 3 times a year. It's very reactive. At the time, this was pre the AI hype, and I had a team of engineers that were out in India, and it was very painstaking, like on our part, to go in and actually pull all the data, make sense of the data, and try to share anything with teachers that was remotely useful. But when the world of AI came to the masses, that was when I kind of had the idea to start Strive. And yeah, we are about a year and a couple months in. And then I would say the other big inspiration for me is I have 2 little ones. I have a 6 and 8-year-old based out of Davis. They're in 1st and 3rd grade. I say 2.5 because that little puppy is definitely probably more than a half. But Davis is actually our first district to come on to sign a full district-wide contract this year. And then we're talking to Natomas and Rockland as well. And it's somewhat of a FOMO is what I've realized is like you get one district and I'm like, oh, Davis is using you? Okay, we're interested as well. And so lots of exciting stuff ahead. I didn't know like the makeup of the room here, so I thought I'd maybe kick off with a really basic AI refresh with the caveat that I'm the CEO and I have a CTO that does this stuff way better than I do. But as a quick caveat, I think everyone in this room knows, but what's AI? AI learns from data to make predictions, things like automated grading in our world, virtual assistants, a little bit about what an LLM. These are models that learn from a lot of data to generate human-like language. I will kind of go through this quickly and I'll get you to the point of why I brought this up. And how do they learn? We expose them to various data sets. So in the world of education, you guys may, when you think of data on a kid, think about grades and quizzes and assessments, but there's actually a ton of data that, for example, just sits in their student information system around demographics of a child, how a child is learning, what they're struggling on. You wrap that up with things like assessment data, and even more granular if you do things like ed tech data, progress monitoring data. It starts to paint this really beautiful, holistic picture of why or why not a child is mastering a certain concept. Oftentimes, the way that our industry is set up is we say, Shweta got a C, Justin got an A, we both move on. And so whether or not I've mastered a concept, we both move on to the next topic the next day, which generally they find, research says that by grade 3, most kids are at least a grade level behind. And we're seeing that become much more of a problem since COVID, with the COVID learning loss. A little bit more on the AI side, there's different types of learning. There's supervised, unsupervised learning. Supervised is when you're learning with a labeled data. So things like this is a cat, or unsupervised, which where you're looking at patterns. Our goal really with Strive is to identify unique patterns that we're seeing across student level data. And why is it important to have diversity of data? That just gives you more comprehensive insights. The last thing I'll kind of mention on the AI side before I jump into Strive is really the idea around vertical AI. So I think like you're right to say that there was this hype and there was this, potentially AI could do X, Y, Z. What I'm seeing a lot more of in our industry in health tech that you might know more about, Rich, and fintech, things like that, is we're starting to see these organizations, whether they're existing organizations or startups coming out that are really honing in on industry-specific data sets. And what that's essentially doing is while they're using an existing LLM like OpenAI as their kind of baseline, they're tuning and or training their models to become very, very smart about a very specific industry. And our goal is to do that in the education world. Now, there's different ways to go about doing that, and data, especially in our space with student privacy and stuff like that, is hard to come by. And so as we continue to grow, we're kind of thinking through our model. And what we're essentially doing is, before I jump into kind of how we're doing it, the why behind why we need to even exist and why it's even important outside of what I just mentioned around student data and how we use data today, is that in schools today, we literally have more kids that are behind their grade level than ever before. And this is since like the advent of formal education. I walked into a 6th grade classroom this year, and the kids were reading at grade levels kindergarten through 5th. Like not a kid was on 6th grade level. And the teacher was like, I don't know how to teach the basic building blocks of like phonemic awareness, and was just like at a loss. And he was like, I can only do my best to kind of help move kids forward. To your question?
Yeah, I think at COVID, how much did your dad find that COVID impact on that?
Sorry, given the advent of
COVID.
COVID, yeah.
COVID.
It make things worse.
It moves on learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there was difficulty with students attention in class, right? They don't have their cameras on, and so how many kids you know were actually paying attention in class too, So I guess how much of that data did you find was the grade level, when reading grade levels dropped after COVID?
Yeah, we started 2023, so our data isn't looking that far back, but the NAEP overall research says that students lost, on average, more than a year's worth of learning, and in Black and brown communities is disproportionately higher than that. And of course, like generally what ends up happening in these situations, it's the lower socioeconomic communities that feel the brunt of all of that. And so we are catching up, which is good news, but we're not nearly where we need to be. I mean, they are projecting that COVID is putting us, like this entire generation of kids that were in elementary And specifically, interestingly enough, kids that were supposed to be in preschool during COVID are seeing the hardest hit because they lost an entire year of social emotional development. And that's kind of keystone foundational for them to grow then beyond that. I have a first grader and a third grader, and my third grader was in kindergarten during COVID. And those kids are like, teachers have literally retired because of that cohort. Like, it's just a hard cohort to deal with. And it's just a lot of stuff that we don't even realize happened during COVID, where they didn't have access to like a routine environment that supports them. But not only that, I'm going to skip this for a second. We have 300,000 teachers that left the profession since COVID, and McKinsey is expecting 900,000 more to leave in the next few years. And so somebody said this, and I totally agree. We are literally in a state of emergency. Like, teaching was hard to begin with low pay. And then when you're coming in and you can't even support your kids on like the one thing you're there to do, which is help them learn and grow, because they're so disparate and you don't really have the tools to get them there. It just feels easier than ever before to quit. And then to top that off, schools data is painful. You work in schools, if anybody else has ever been even a parent, you know that like we had some access into what our kids were doing during COVID, but it's painful. It's pretty disparate. You get, I think some of the best teachers that I've spoken to, the way they use data is they give a kid what we call an exit ticket. So it's a short 3 to 5 question, quiz at the end of a lesson. The kids come back, they grade it, and they're like, didn't get it, got it, above average. And that is like how they think about their data. And not to knock that, that's a perfectly reasonable way. But in 2024, I feel like we can do better for our kiddos and for our teachers. So what do we do? So when you're thinking about the world of data and education, there is about 50 to 60 there. When you talk to a school district, they'll say we use 200 to 300 different vendors. The reality is there's probably about 50 to 60 vendors that make up 90% of relevant student data. Some of you might recognize this if you have kids. CAST is our California State Assessment. iReady is a common one that's used for formative assessments. That's just a different way of saying a yearly assessment versus we do like assessments a couple times a year. There's EdTech tools, which have a uptake that varies dependent on the district, but I have found that we're used with fidelity, at least for us, we can pull some really skill level data that's super helpful for our models and for our recommendations. But again, the jury is out on really the efficacy of those products. And then there's of course a bunch of data around grades. And then we also tie in there things like attendance, social, emotional, and behavior. When you even combine all of these different data sets, even then you're talking about a little less than 100 vendors whose data that we need to deeply understand to build the best-in-class vertical AI model for education. Now, that sounds like a lot, but the reality is in the world of AI, that's actually very doable. Like 100 vendors, you're talking, most of them don't have APIs, sadly. You're usually looking at a CSV spreadsheet that gets dumped into some secure SFTP, and our engineers go in, they make sure they understand the data. They actually use AI to analyze the data and then kind of build in guardrails on our back end to say, every time you see this kind of a data sheet, which are all standardized no matter how many schools use it, analyze it in this way. Now, what that means is, and I'm the only non-technologist on my team and come from a school background. So what that means is that some level, when we first kicked off, they were fully reliant on me analyzing all of these files and making sense of it, which is one person that says, okay, this is an assessment file. Here are the different columns. Here are the relevant columns. Here's how we need to think about tiered growth versus just absolute growth. And here are the metrics we should be solving for. Now, we recognized fairly quickly that I would be a bottleneck to that process, that if it was always just coming from me, or even if I built a small team of people, we'd have our biases, we'd have our ways of analyzing the data. And so what we've essentially done is we started talking to all of our early Lighthouse districts. We're now in 17 districts. We're launching in now-ish fall, this fall. So we realized, okay, every time we show a data file to a different district, they look at it slightly differently, but there are overlaps. And so every district was like, okay, if I have this one iReady file, I want you to look at these 5 things. And then the next district would be like, I want you to look at these 7 things, right? And eventually over time, what we're finding is the AI is smart enough to essentially go in and see the patterns. And that's what we're trying to really capitalize on is we've identified about 50 live test districts that we're working closely with and trying to understand how each of them analyzes different points of data from these 100 and so vendors. Obviously, they don't all use 100. Usually we pull in about 3 to 5 vendors per school that they find relevant. And then we leverage AI through crowdsourcing data analysis. So what that essentially means is after we do this with our first 50 districts, the 51st district will have the benefit of the patterns we've already identified through the first early district that we worked with. And this is really important. It means that we grow a little slower than perhaps the typical AI startup, but this is also really hard work, and we feel okay with taking the time to say, how can we work very intimately, almost at a bespoke level with every customer that comes on in these first 2 years, get a really good sense of how to analyze these different data indicators, use them to also come in. So we created an admin portal where they can come in and they can kind of tweak the guardrails that are being sent to our AI. And then kind of, like I said, crowdsource that data analysis so that we can then do it at mass and grow after 2 years much faster. What does that look like in practice? We pull in their data, we learn from the data, and then we provide actionable feedback. And particularly our feedback is focused on classroom level feedback. So there's a lot of tools. Most of our competitors focus a lot at the district level to say, as a district, again, 3 times a year, you're going to be looking for X, Y, Z. You'll use us to create some dashboards, some charts and graphs. The beauty of the world of AI is like, I say never, but maybe never say never, but we will never probably have a dashboard. The idea is like, how do we take all this data in and not give you a chart and graph to analyze because nobody's got time for that, but really give you actionable recommendations. This is a lot. Generally, anybody that comes in, whether you're a teacher, you're a school leader, or an administrator, you'd see 3 to 5 at max. But it's set up kind of like an inbox that says, like this one particularly is a recommendation around lesson planning. We've pulled in their data. We know we've also pulled in their scope and sequence. And if we have access to the curriculum, we pull that in. We've only done that for a couple of districts right now. But in this particular recommendation, we noticed we're teaching a lesson on polynomials this week. I know it's really small, so read it. These 5 kids are not meeting prereqs for this lesson, blah, blah, blah. And then it gives you some ideas around how to think about supporting those kids. So we understand that not everyone is a prompt engineer. And so we initially started our beta as a Q&A chatbot. And then we saw that that worked. And we then got to getting to this kind of UI where you come in, you kind of understand the structure because most people have used email before. You can go in and you can kind of scroll down. This is just a screenshot, but you can scroll down. And at the bottom, it'll even show you other recommended questions you can ask of that particular recommendation. You can obviously dig deeper by asking, other questions of that data, or you can just start like a brand new, fresh, whatever question. The other kind of big feature that we've just launched is just bookmarking things. We realized certain people just wanted certain things that they needed to know every single day. As an educator, you probably like, I just need to come in and know these 3 things to start my day. And so some of our educators were like, I just like to bookmark prompts or questions. And so we launched that this year and it's been exciting. I mean, I won't say that it's always this beautiful. It's finicky and there are many times where it doesn't answer the question. We have a way to actually pull those questions, log those questions, and make sure we're tweaking our AI to make sure that it can answer those questions. But it's exciting. We are getting questions like, for example, some of our teachers are asking which students, I get their lives coming in and out, but which students have not mastered the prereq skills for today's lesson. From the last 2 assessments, which kids have not made the recommended tiered growth, and what are they struggling on? Which students in 6th grade are performing below average on their assessments and have missed more than 5 days of school. This one's like a really interesting one because it integrates both attendance and academics, which is the goal. We know that there's a high rate of chronic absenteeism that we're seeing post, especially COVID, and that leads directly to learning loss. And there's a direct correlation to kids that are missing more school than, if I haven't been in school for 5 years, years, 5 days, and Justin has. We're both struggling on the same skill. You'd probably approach him differently than you would be as an educator. And so we're tiptoeing around that a little bit because there's a lot of research and science that says, here's how you triangulate social emotional with attendance, with behavior, with academics that we haven't integrated quite yet. We're not just there. But we just put out our first IES proposal to work with a lovely researcher called Digital Promise that is kind of helping us build that level of overlap. So right now, all of our recommendations, they can ask this. The system might even respond with at least the first quantitative version of the part of this, or at least they can have response quantitatively, but it won't, if they dig deeper, it won't kind of give them recommendations because we put the guardrails in place to make sure that it's not giving like hallucinating recommendations. Hopefully the goal for us is to get to a point where this kind of a heat map is what we create for every child. Where kids understand over the course of their K-12 journey, how they're doing, how they're mastering on different skills. And the idea is to always look at it with an asset-based mindset. You've done these, 20 things, and you have like these next 3 things that are make sense in your journey. But it'll take us some time to get there to do that.
Well, I was wondering, do you customize this for teachers individually or for the department?
For the school, we start at the district level, and then we kind of get first their insights. We get data share agreements in place at the district level. Usually they start with 3 to 5 vendors. That includes their SIS system. And then because we have data at the student level, teachers are able to log in, but we're being very mindful about our early pilot users. I was just saying to Justin, there's probably a handful of users in every district right now that are giving us they're giving us grace for one, and 2, they're being very thoughtful about how they're the kinds of questions they're submitting and the feedback that we're getting from them.
Early adopters.
Our early adopters, exactly. Yeah, and I think that was the crux of my presentation, but yeah, happy to take any questions there.
Question is, I see that you have optimized approach for each school as far as I understood.
Yeah.
Do you have any pedagogical models that you're trying?
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time this past. We launched our beta in January, which was a fairly plain Jane. We just kind of did it on top of OpenAI. And we integrated a couple of data sheets from a particular school in Oakland. And then we shared that with a couple of other districts and got some feedback. We spent the next 6 months integrating not only standards level information, Common Core standards, but we've actually worked with a group called Achieve the Core, which are the folks that built a lot of the Common Core standards, who have gone way beyond that now and actually build mastery-based progressions and competency-based learning into our model. And so the model is smart in that it is it's understanding education-specific things that are not just currently sitting on the internet, but we continue to refine that as we work with districts.
Is it something in the literature? Because, there are several models like Bloom's taxonomy and stuff like that. So one that we refer, is it published somewhere?
Did you go to school in the U.S.?
Yes.
You did, okay.
I was a professor.
You were a professor at elementary here?
I was in university.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking.
The reason I'm asking is because I was in India this summer and they were asking me a similar question because there's different boards in other countries that you then align to those standards here.
I got German education, that's fine, but
Yeah.
I'm asking, about the references and,
Yeah, we've largely trained it on understanding Common Core standards. And beyond that, there's a lot of stuff that we tested out on its understanding of, again, mastery-based progressions. But beyond that, we haven't done specific
and the
training.
second part was the FERPA. I didn't see anything about FERPA. So
Yeah.
if a company comes to my case and, sign something, I wouldn't sign.
Yeah.
How are you dealing with that?
Yeah, so great question. My CTO has his last startup was in the health tech space. And so he HIPAA, yeah, exactly, was very compliant to all the HIPAA regulations. He's brought a similar lens to the work that we're doing here, especially when it comes to student data and privacy. I didn't include that, I probably should, that's a good point, mainly because I'm not the expert on that, but everything that we're doing is, and you might actually understand this better than me technically, is not scalable, but safe. So what that means is right now, everything that we're doing sits in its own like data lake for every school. That's probably not a scalable model for us to continue to grow, but in the process of being an early stage startup with limited capacity, like this is how we built it so we stay compliant and we make sure that we're being as safe as we can. The goal is to, obviously get it to a point where it becomes.
Yeah, you rely on
So-
as a certification, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. And also an interesting, to your point, do you have kids? Yeah. So you probably don't even realize this. I've, like I said, 2 kids as well. All of our kids' data right now, anytime your school brings in an external vendor, even, for example, Power Schools in our backyard, Folsom here, they are sharing your kids' data with Power School. You are not signing a separate agreement to the school to allow them to use Power School. But when you register your kid, you're signing on a dotted line that says,
In Eureka,
you choose-
mines are in Eureka, and in Eureka, they are meeting, if there's something like that, and they are getting like certain signatures from us. So.
oh,
Interesting.
wow.
That's not sufficient.
So.
Wow. Okay. I know David's, for example, we just got Power School last year. Like the parents I know because I'm working with them, but the parents got no indication that we're using Power School. What will happen though, and I will say districts are on this, so it's nothing to be necessarily nervous about, is there will be a CIO-esque person at the district that requires that every vendor goes through a certain amount of security
Yeah,
scrutiny.
they're introducing us.
Exactly.
They're presenting what they have and how it, and if there is an interest.
Yeah. But even beyond that, like someone that's very technical at the district is already going through, like as a vendor for Davis, we had to like go through a review process to make sure we were compliant. And that is often a big reason why vendors don't get through schools is they can't like pass that whole privacy process. In fact,
Like healthcare, there's similarities that demonstrate.
yeah. The gold standard bearer of this world is Chicago Public Schools. So if you're a vendor that passes the Chicago Public Schools like scrutiny, you could pretty much go anywhere in the country. But it takes like a good 12 to 18 months to get through their vendor approval process because they have a lot of, and most startups can't afford to actually do what is required to be in a place like Chicago Public Schools. But there's a lot of regulations they put in place.
Yeah, thank you.
So for the districts that are participating now, where are they finding the either investment or reallocation to
Yeah.
fund the system?
So it's totally, so one, at an early adopter stage, we're not charging them nearly at market. With Davis particularly, they actually found a funder to come in and fund this work because we had approached them post-budget season. We have 12 districts of the 17 that are in Nashville. And they are coming in through a data provider. And so actually our go-to-market is to actually tap people that already are working with districts and already have access to, whatever the folks that would give us the access to the data. So in this case, it's a SPED services provider. They bring in their clinicians and SPED teachers to teach kids on campus. And we're just doing it for their SPED population. And in that case, the SPED services provider is paying for that. We have 3 districts that allocated their own budget and, signed contracts with us and found money in their budget, but that's becoming increasingly hard. A number of you might have heard, but the government funding called ESSER funds or EANS if you're a private school just is drying out this month, literally September 30th of this month. So schools will have until I think January to utilize all of those funds, otherwise they go back. Most of them, a lot of them, I shouldn't say that. A chunk of the schools have already used the money and were being fiscally responsible about not putting it towards things that they needed in the long term but wouldn't be able to afford, or they put it towards personnel that was needed during COVID or, whatever, desks and things like that. But there's a lot of schools that are, just at a point where they're like, okay, like, and they're cutting things out, right? Because they paid for a bunch, but also it's forcing them to really rethink if they really need a product, right? So during COVID, schools bought a bunch of things. I was just reading an article that one school is cutting Zoom. It's like $100,000 for the school to have Zoom, right? And so could they use just Google Meet? Probably. It's probably fine. But did they need Zoom during COVID, and was Zoom free for them during COVID? Absolutely, right. And so there's a lot of reassessment of efficacy of these tools. And so ed tech companies are hurting. The good news with the work that we're doing is we're kind of providing them a way to actually do that assessment better. Obviously, it's a new tool, so we still have the same hurdles, but it's a different kind of ROI for them. Sorry, David, go ahead.
I have two questions. First question builds on the second question, but does the data that you pull factor in, like, for example, PE with different enrichment activities that kids do? And then I'll have you answer that one. I just forgot my second question.
We would pull in PE if it's graded. Now, transparently, our focus right now is on ELA and STEM. And so a lot, like if it has a direct, like if there was eventually there would be a world where that PE grade overlaps with the attendance, overlaps with what's happening from a behavior perspective, maybe some parent even engagement, home data, and gives a more holistic picture. Yeah, a lot of our recommendations are solely honing in on patterns that we're seeing academically.
The second question I remember is, are you using this data to help educators reform curriculum or teaching standards as well?
Yeah, so great question. So that's a little tricky, and I'll tell you why. It's because generally districts will go in and purchase a curriculum that has a certain level of rigor behind it. That's actually why districts hate when teachers go on ChatGPT and try to like make lesson plans. It's generally not rigorous. I actually sat and I presented to a room of like 20 administrators, and they were like, you freak me out because I think that our teachers are going to stop teaching the curriculum we just spent millions of dollars on and like focusing in on these small group tier 2 types of instruction. So we shifted our model after that feedback to say, none of the recommendations are going to necessarily change your tier 1 curriculum, but it will help you scaffold that better. So you saw like some of the recommendations are like, these 5 kids are struggling. That doesn't mean don't teach what you need to teach in your sequence, but any good educator, and you can probably speak to this, will be able to say, okay, I'm going to teach this whole class lesson, but then I'm going to kind of walk around to this group because I know that they're struggling, and I'm going to, chime in here. I'm going to create an independent, whatever group here and just have them do at-bats practice, after I've done my lesson. I'm going to do a small group. I'm going to pull a small group, right? And I'm going to, do a reteach, right? And so we help them in everything that happens post delivering that whole class instruction.
So what do you see as your approach in the future with changing the standard in which is taught? And how do you see AI being brought into that? And at what point and when?
And changing the standard in which?
Just how you're saying how a lot of the education that is taught, students are below or not meeting standards.
Yeah.
And how do you see the work that you're doing change that in the future? And when do you see like a good shift and when we start to see that actually being rolled out with kids being affected by it?
There was actually a lot, and I can't take credit for this, there was a lot of really lovely, innovative school leaders that are being much more mindful and thoughtful of mastery-based, what I call mastery-based learning, which is really looking at one, like not absolute growth. So you're in 3rd grade and you did in 3rd grade level reading, and if you didn't, you didn't grow. If you came in at 1st grade level and you moved up to 2nd grade in 6 months, like that's phenomenal growth. And so how do we really think about like tiered growth as opposed to absolute? And then 2, how do we really think about, again, mastery of concepts? So like even at Davis, my kids don't get an ABCD. In fact, I was just explaining that to my daughter yesterday. She was like, oh, really? That would be fun. They get a 1, 2, 3, 4 on standards, right? And it's not even like in her first report card, they expect her to have all 4s. They expect her to have 1s and 2s because it's grade level content, right? And then over the course of the year, obviously they want to move her up. And so there's an entire consortium called the Mastery-Based Consortium that's like focused on really like shifting how we think about standards-based learning and absolutes. We are a part of that ecosystem. I don't know that we will ever be the people that are like the reason it all shifts. But the hope is that as a piece of that puzzle, we can kind of plug in our data and say, if you are doing data-driven instruction more regularly, it's going to become obvious, right? Right now, teachers don't really have a map to how to even support their kids, right? They're just kind of moving through and then they do like whatever an assessment every now and then. How do we go in and support them to kind of have the right data to shift their instruction?
I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So with homeschooling and charter school students, where parents can teach the curriculum and how they want to teach it, and they can go and do the things that they want to do from government appropriated funds and resources, you think that would be a faster, I guess, market to implementing the data that you're capturing than in the public school system?
In homeschool, potentially because the ratios are just smaller, so it's easier to do. But generally, when you're homeschooling, you have a good sense of this information already anecdotally at some level. Charters actually do need to follow similar compliant. I mean, there's different charters. Most of your like decent charters do follow a similar, strategy as public schools. Now, I will say charters are often more data driven because every 5 years they're up for a renewal. And so every 5 years they need to fight to keep their school open, as opposed to public schools don't really have that same level of like pressure. Obviously, it's other kinds of pressures in public schools, but every 5 years they need to go through a process where parents come in and they have a whole vote and things like that. And if they literally do not meet their numbers academically, they will be shut down. And so charters are an easier customer for us because they already like prioritize data-driven instruction, but they're a pain in the butt because they prioritize data-driven instruction, if that makes sense, because they're like, we've got a way, we know exactly how to do it, fit into our system or you're out kind of thing. So they're a really interesting use case for us because we can get their attention. But then, I mean, I literally had KIPP tell me they didn't like the use of the word achievement in our platform. They're like, we don't use achievement. I was like, okay. And so they're very, they're so oftentimes, especially if there's like the KIPPs or the rocket ships of the world, some of these more renowned charters that are known to do data-driven instruction well in a really good way, oftentimes are harder for us to penetrate because they've already got a lot of systems in place.
High agency, high risk.
Yeah, most of the time, so they will come to us and say, we have a ton of data, but it's not being used in the classroom. So their data is generally sitting at the, district level or within like school leader, PLC kind of discussions. They obviously are doing like, coaching and stuff like that based on the data, but teachers are not the ones that are regularly like logging in somewhere and looking at that data, unless it's like the data that happens a couple times a year.
Thank you.
So one of the challenges that most are, the biggest challenge, one of the first challenges is getting that first customer. And I think it's even more difficult because you are in front of the government education. How did you get your first customer?
A lot of begging and putting no. Our first customer was the Oakland-based charter.
Mm-hmm.
And we just who connected us. There was somebody who made an introduction. The ED was fairly new. The charter was failing. They had 2 years to renewal. Failing as in like they were really struggling. They had 2 years to renewal. She kind of came in to clean things up. She was looking for data that didn't exist. And she was like, I will do anything. I was like, great. And she had a person that worked for her that was like kind of her right hand who became our internal champion, opened up his doors for us. We like literally just spent hours just in their classrooms. They were a project-based learning site. So it was also a very interesting first customer for us to have. They didn't even grade their kids. Their grades were all based on 21st century skills. So like grit and perseverance and things like that. And he was like, this is good, but kind of need to understand how you're doing like academically too. And so it just like right time, right place, I think, right connection. And they were and continue to be fundamental to helping us iterate every piece of the product from beta to alpha. And they were small, 4 schools in Oakland. And I think that was helpful. Like we couldn't go into, we got introduced to SF Unified, who like we're definitely not going to SF Unified right now, but that was like 6 months ago. And I was like, no, like we're not even ready for that. There was a SF Ed Fund supports a lot of their work, especially around data, but particularly with volunteers coming into SF Unified. they were willing to pay for it, and we actually turned it down, so we're just not ready for that. So we have a sweet spot. Our sweet spot is like somewhere between 10 to 20, 10 to 30-ish schools. Davis is 16, and it's like manageable for us. Natomas, Rockland are a little bit bigger. But we're kind of now ready to take on some of these bigger districts, and we're finding that we show them. I mean, we literally were talking to school in Philly, and we were talking to someone in administration, and she was like, please don't show this to any of our school leaders, because if they think this exists, like they're going to want it right away. Because it's like, wow, finally I can actually not get a chart and graph, and I have an actionable to-do that's personalized to me and my students. Like that in and of itself, people are really excited about. But there's a lot of steps to get there around like data sharing and things like that, where she was like, I don't know if we're going to even be able to share data. Like we need to go through a whole process. And so the wow factor exists when we do our demos. Like it's generally not a hard sell. It's just that there's a lot of people in the room that need to say okay before we can actually go.
So with Oakland, I mean, with your pilot, what was the output like? You know, were you able to, I don't know, you reduce?
We didn't go through the whole school year, so we didn't quite measure. I mean, the goal was to get to a point where this will be our first full school year. We launched in January, and so we did a very small pilot, and it was more like, can we make sure we're not hallucinating? Can we make sure that we are giving you answers that you're actually looking for? So we did a whole session where we just captured questions they had. Okay, here's like 5 data sets, and like, what would you ask for these questions? So we fed that to our system, and we figured out what worked, what didn't work. So it's a lot of testing. This will be our first year where we're going to actually be able to follow through and say, at least with our pilot teachers, what are we seeing in terms of shift of like tiered growth? And because we have access to all the student like growth data, we can easily measure that.
Okay.
So this looks like a great tool for, districts and school employees to understand their data, something needed. I'm curious, you probably also get into conversations where the response is, oh my God, AI, it's going to be the death of us. Students are cheating. What are we going to do? I'm just wondering how you handle that end. Do you just exit out of that conversation?
Literally, they're not early adopters.
And I think there's a lot of, let-ons, and I think those conversations happen with calculators and the internet.
Yeah,
right? And my personal belief is schools are going to have to figure out how to teach their students to use AI correctly. Do you engage at all in that, or just kind of?
Honestly, those people that are like freaking out about it, like they're not our early adopters. Hopefully they will come on board at some point, but they're not the people we're approaching. Now that said, I would say that in my 15 years in this space, this is the technology I have seen the most uptake of. Of course, there's the naysayers at the grassroots teacher level. There's an entire nonprofit called Play Lab, which essentially like allows teachers to go in and play with AI models and like build their own tools. And there's thousands and thousands of things that teachers themselves have gone in and created and like in a safe space. And it's incredible. Like you just haven't seen that level of uptake really that fast. Really with anything, at least in my time, that's really taken, that long. Now that said, the frustrating thing can be like Philly Public Schools, we got through everybody at the curriculum level, at the administration level, whatever. Our last conversation was their CIO, and this guy comes from Oracle or somebody. Anyways, he's been there for 6 years. He's created a bunch of systems. He is like literally our bottleneck. And so he's like, nope, I need like a sandbox, and I need this, and I'm like, give me 6 months or something, right? Like I'm just, and
reviews.
yeah, exactly. We're just not, as a startup, we're just not there, right? And so I'm kind of like, okay, I'm having the chief academic officer calling me saying, hey, what happened? Did you talk to Peter? And I'm like, yeah, I did, but like Peter's not letting me through. And so, and that's unfortunate, and that's okay. There's absolutely going to be organizations or districts like that, but there's enough, I would say, momentum. I don't know that we're at the bottom of the hype in the education world, although some might disagree, but there's still enough of a momentum where I think what has happened for us is a lot of the early players that kind of built wrappers, people sussed them out and they were like, okay, these are just wrappers. And now we're getting into a point where people are really having to prove their differentiation. And that's making for a lot of interesting dialogue where people are like, oh, you're not just a rapper, like you're really building something that's going to work for me. So
Nice.
Well, honestly, I'd love to be able to comment. It might be a good-
thank you.
My question is, right, so this is for, I see how it can benefit, kids that are suffering in the classroom, right? What about the kids that are excelling in class, right? If they see the class is too easy for them, what do you do? What can be done for them? Do you ever think of implementing an idea for the teachers like, hey, this kid is too smart for this class, right? Based on the
Yeah.
work that you have. You maybe steer him in this direction, right? Or steer her in this direction, right? Like, do you have a solution for kids that are excelling in the programs that aren't really like, okay, you might have a kid in class say, I'm not really gaining in this class. It's very easy for me, right? And this kid might be struggling, but for me, I'm taking it as easy, so I can push an AP class. I'm this, you know what I mean? Like, so, yeah, what are those?
The short answer is no. No. The more complicated version of that is we are not in the business of recommending curriculum, and that is by design. And I'll tell you why. All of my time in working with like an iReady or Alexia or Freckle or whatever, what ends up happening, a lot of investors will say this too. They're like, oh, well, iReady already makes these recommendations. It groups these kids. It tells you what standards they're struggling on. You and I both know, knowing what standard a kid's struggling on, it tells me nothing as an educator. I need to understand much more granularity. But they hide that by design because what they'll say is hey, these kids are all struggling here on this standard. Go do more iReady because that's their cash cow, right? So they will remediate with 100 more minutes on iReady. Like they'll figure it out. What teachers are saying to us is they're saying, actually, I just need to know, like, is it more at-bats practice that's required? Is it that they're way beyond and like I need to do something else? Is it I need to just sit with them for 5 minutes? Like I want to be in the driver's seat, right? So as soon as we start recommending, hey, this kid's bored and here's 20 things the kid could do because for extension, we'll start getting beholden to our curriculum. And that's a different world that I currently do not want to mess with. So our goal is to sit in this neutral space where we say, no matter what you're using, we ingest that data and we allow the teacher to make the decision as an educator on whether that's more kids bored and needs to do something else, or kids need support, or kids somewhere in the middle. My daughter's a great example of somewhere in the middle. She never gets looked at. She's a good kid. She doesn't, bother anyone, but she's somewhere in the middle, right? And so how do you kind of allow the teacher to make the best decision on how to mix and match their time with their kids is kind of where we are right now. Now, I don't know how we'll evolve. Startups pivot, obviously, a billion times over, but my personal opinion is it's really, really a risky place to start getting to a point where you're recommending specific things to do.
Like, me personally, I want to get this weekend, as the educator person, then when I look at the educator that like a little less experience, right? They may want that recommendation.
Yeah.
They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to take their course, right? Maybe they want to do something more innovative, something rejuvenating for the program. Maybe the head of the department don't, they don't, they highlight every idea, they run out of ideas, right? How can you help me make my department, my English department, my math department substantially stronger so that I can, make school overall better? I can see like, certain schools that take pride in having an excellent math program or having an excellent, English program, want to see, hey, where are we at? What can we improve on that maybe another school, right? Because I'm doing both school, right? So
Yeah.
there's kind of a competition right there with trying to see numbers and retain kids, right? Because the kids paying X amount of dollars for their kids coming to school, they want to know, hey, this money is worth it. If I'm paying $20,000 a year for my kid, I want to know, that he's getting the best of the education, right? So
Yeah.
that's why I think it may be beneficial to look into that because for those type of higher tier schools.
Yeah. And like I said, never say never, I don't know. We might be in a world, we were talking to this company that's based out of San Mateo called Guru, Gooru, and they spent years curating OER resources. So these are open resources that teachers pull from, and some are great, some are not. And so they curated it and they put it in this beautiful package. They built like this competency map for kids. And then they started, watching what kids were performing these things. one of the ways that generally that happens in schools is kids will go on to some sort of ed tech tool right now. Unfortunately, there's a really lovely article that just came out by a guy by the name of Lawrence Holt, who was doing a study on like where do ed tech tools really help, and it's helping the top 5%. The other 95% are usually unengaged. If they were going to be engaged through an ed tech tool, then like we'd be in a very different spot. And so maybe the answer somewhere there is that. When I was at Rocket Ship, we had a learning lab, which was a 90-minute block where we literally had, once kids met their goals, they went offline. It was the opposite of like they went to like a robotics lab or they went to science or a library or whatever. So there's a multitude of ways that schools are getting creative. Again, I'm not sure that we are the person that's going to be the driver of that, but I hope that we're the initiator of that. If that makes sense.
You. This is a question regarding when you went through the process of choosing your CTO, was it someone that you knew? Or did you actually go through like an company or some sort of resource that links you together?
I wish it was the latter, but no, it was, I mean, I would say that my first startup was a nonprofit. My second startup was Bootstrap. My third startup was under Rocket Ship as a, like whatever was part of, so we were funded from them. This is the first time I'm doing like the whole VC world and investors and equity and all of the above. And it is very, very hard to find the right fit from a personality perspective and then from an expertise perspective. I went through 3 different people before I landed on this guy. I had an engineer who just built a prototype who kind of knew wasn't going to be the CTO, but could be an early engineer. It didn't work out. Went through a second person who her and I had like a lovely connection. And then she just couldn't figure out the product. And then this guy who came on actually fractionally initially and was introduced to me through friends and had just left his role. So timing was right. Built our beta and then has come on full time since just a couple months ago. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you bundle things part of it to the parents, for example?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think we're a couple, well, maybe like a few years away from that. And I say that because we have to make sure that everything that goes out to a parent or goes in front of a student is absolutely right and on par. I mean, they're going to be our biggest critics now, and rightly so. Now that said, we will bring them along the journey. So there was a really interesting company called In Bloom that started and failed in 2014 to 16. Gates funded it like $100 million. And it was actually like what they were trying to do was kind of really make student data secure and build these like kind of standards. And I like feel like an encyclopedia on their demise. And a big part of their demise was a parent group that started in New York that was like, Gates is taking your kids' data and like whatever, doing whatever with it, right? And honestly, like I think they just did a really poor job marketing to the parents and bringing them along the journey and having these conversations. Now, the first thing I did when we started talking to Davis was talk to the PTA president. And he didn't really respond to me, like sort of responded to me, but at least I involved him in the conversation. Like, hey, data, kids, like, let's talk. I want your feedback. And that was by design to say, like, I'm keeping you a part of the loop and like, here's what it can do. Ultimately, one of the first people that signed off on our contract there was the Davis Schools Foundation, which is run by a group of parents that go to Davis. And so that's a key part of how we think about go-to-market is how do we make sure that parents are involved until we can get to a point where we share with parents. Now, that's also tricky because no parent wants another app to log into. I know I don't. In my last startup, we used to text parents and they loved that. So we were a goals-based platform for EdTech data. Every Monday they'd get a text that your kid has to do X. Every Thursday that your kid finished Y, give them a pizza party or whatever. At some point we were going to build out a parent app and they were like, we don't want another app. And so we are happy with the text we got. So we'll have to kind of figure out how we share that data and at what level we share that data. Schools are also a bit leery about getting parents involved, so we need to like go through the process. A lot of times it creates more work for teachers. And teachers don't want to be more like, they don't want more emails to write to. So it's an iterative process. So they're on the roadmap there.